heart of Los Angeles, a city shimmering with Hollywood lights and post-war dreams, a tragedy was about to unfold that would etch itself into the annals of American crime history. The year was 1947, a time when returning soldiers, booming industries, and aspiring stars all converged on the same streets, chasing opportunity and survival. The murder that would become known as the Black Dahlia was not just a crime. It was a story that captured the imagination of the nation and left scars that never healed. But before the brutal discovery that shocked the city, there was a young woman with dreams, flaws, and a desire to belong. Her name was Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in the working-class town of Medford, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo and Phoebe Short. Life in the Short household was far from easy. The Great Depression had crippled countless American families, and the Shorts were no exception. When Elizabeth was just 6 years old, tragedy struck. Her father suddenly disappeared. Cleo abandoned his family by faking his own death, leaving his car near a bridge in what authorities believed was a suicide. For years, Phoebe raised the girls alone, struggling with finances, but determined to keep the family afloat. This early abandonment would deeply impact Elizabeth's view of men and her yearning for stability. Growing up, Elizabeth was known for her striking beauty. Pale skin, raven black hair, and vibrant blue-green eyes made her stand out among her peers. She had an almost cinematic presence, the kind of allure that could capture a room without her even trying. Yet beneath this beauty lay fragility. As a teenager, Elizabeth suffered from chronic asthma and had to undergo lung surgery, which left her weak and unable to handle cold winters. Because of her condition, she often spent time in Florida during colder months, staying with family friends to improve her health. These trips ignited her fascination with travel, new places, and eventually the dream of Hollywood. By the time she entered her late teens, Elizabeth longed for escape. Her small town upbringing in Massachusetts felt suffocating, and like many young women of her era, she was enchanted by the glamour of the silver screen. In the early 1940s, she moved to California, following in the footsteps of countless hopefuls who believed Hollywood held the key to reinvention. But unlike the stars who would eventually shine, Elizabeth's life in California was far from glamorous. In Santa Barbara, she worked as a waitress and tried to immerse herself in the social scene, but trouble followed her. In 1943, at just 19 years old, Elizabeth was arrested for underage drinking at a local bar. The incident was minor, but her mugshot was taken, a haunting photograph that would later resurface in newspapers after her death, used to paint her as a troubled young woman. After the arrest, Elizabeth was sent back to Massachusetts, but the lure of California never left her heart. Returning to the West Coast, she attempted to build a new life, moving between Los Angeles and other cities. Friends and acquaintances described her as a dreamer, someone who talked often about becoming an actress. She spent time around servicemen during World War II, forming relationships with soldiers who were stationed nearby. In fact, Elizabeth's romantic life became a frequent topic of gossip, She longed for marriage and stability, often telling friends she wanted to be a wife and mother. However, those dreams never materialized. One of her most significant relationships was with a U.S. Army pilot, Major Matthew Michael Gordon Jr. The two reportedly planned to marry, but Gordon tragically died in a plane crash before that could happen. This devastating loss only deepened Elizabeth's struggles. By 1946, Elizabeth had drifted back to Los Angeles, the city of illusions. She had no permanent address, often moving between cheap hotel rooms, rented apartments, and the couches of friends. She dressed elegantly, favoring stylish black clothing that accentuated her pale complexion. This distinct look would later inspire the press to dub her the Black Dahlia, a name borrowed from the 1946 film The Blue Dahlia, a popular noir movie of the era. Life in Los Angeles, however, was unforgiving. Elizabeth was frequently short on money and relied heavily on acquaintances for food, shelter, and transportation. Despite her struggles, she carried herself with poise and charm. Those who knew her described her as polite, soft-spoken, and almost shy, though some claimed she also harbored a tendency to embellish stories about her past. She projected glamour even when she had nothing. To the outside world, she was a mysterious figure, beautiful, elusive, and unforgettable. The mid-1940s in Los Angeles were also a dangerous time. The city, though glittering with movie premieres and jazz clubs, was plagued by crime, corruption, and a post-war atmosphere of disillusionment. Soldiers who returned from the war often struggled to adjust, and violence was common in the underbelly of the city. Police corruption and organized crime seeped through the cracks of Hollywood's golden facade. It was in this environment that Elizabeth navigated her daily existence, walking a fine line between survival and despair. By January 1947, Elizabeth's life was in flux. She had been seen in San Diego, spending time with a married man and his family, but she soon returned to Los Angeles, reportedly to pursue work. The final days of her life remain murky, pieced together only through scattered eyewitness accounts. Some saw her in hotel lobbies, others in bars, and a few with unidentified men. She was transient, moving silently through the city, a young woman searching for purpose, but unaware that her life was about to end in one of the most brutal murders Los Angeles had ever witnessed. On the morning of January 15, 1947, the dream and the illusion shattered. In a vacant lot in the Limert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, a woman taking her child for a walk stumbled upon a horrifying sight. What she thought at first was a mannequin turned out to be the mutilated, bisected body of Elizabeth Short. Naked, drained of blood, and grotesquely posed, the discovery would send shockwaves through the city. In that moment, Elizabeth Short ceased to be just another struggling young woman chasing dreams. She became the Black Dahlia, an icon of crime history, forever remembered not for her life, but for the mystery of her death. But to understand the full tragedy of the Black Dahlia, one must look beyond the gruesome crime scene. Elizabeth Short was more than a headline, more than a cautionary tale. She was a daughter, a friend, a dreamer, and a human being caught in the turbulence of a city that often devoured the vulnerable. Her murder was not only an act of violence, but also a reflection of the era, an age where women were too often silenced, exploited, and forgotten. As we continue this story, we will walk through the investigation, the suspects, and the endless theories that emerged in the wake of her death. But before all of that, it is crucial to remember Elizabeth as she truly was, a young woman searching for belonging, chasing dreams in a city that promised everything and delivered nothing. Her story begins not with the gruesome crime scene, but with the fragile hope of a girl who wanted to be seen. On the cold morning of January 15th, 1947, Los Angeles awoke to a horror unlike anything it had seen before. In the quiet Lamert Park neighborhood, an area of modest houses and vacant lots, a young mother named Betty Bersinger walked with her 3-year-old daughter. As she pushed her stroller down Norton Avenue, something unusual caught her eye. In the vacant lot ahead, she noticed what appeared to be a broken store mannequin lying in the grass. Its skin was pale, almost white, and the body was split in half at the waist. At first, she thought it had been discarded by a department store, but as she drew closer, the truth became unbearable. What she had found was not a mannequin at all. It was the mutilated body of a woman, sliced into 2 sections, drained of blood, and grotesquely posed. Bersinger screamed, grabbed her daughter, and rushed to the nearest house to call the police. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood was swarming with patrol cars and detectives. What they saw would haunt them forever. The body belonged to Elizabeth Short, though at that moment her identity was not yet known. The sheer brutality of the crime stunned even seasoned investigators. Elizabeth's body had been meticulously washed and drained of blood, leaving her skin ghostly pale. Her mouth had been slashed from ear to ear, creating a disturbing Glasgow smile. The body had been severed at the waist with surgical precision, and the 2 halves were placed deliberately a short distance apart. Her arms were raised above her head, and her legs were spread in a theatrical pose. This was not just murder. It was a display, a statement carved into flesh. The scene was unlike anything Los Angeles police had encountered. The precision of the cuts suggested medical knowledge or surgical skill. The absence of blood at the site indicated that Elizabeth had been killed elsewhere and transported to the vacant lot. Whoever committed this crime had taken time, care, and a chilling attention to detail. Detectives immediately knew they were dealing with something far darker than an ordinary homicide. The news of the discovery spread rapidly, and by the afternoon, reporters were swarming the crime scene. The Los Angeles press of the 1940s was relentless, hungry for sensational stories to feed their readers. The murder of a beautiful young woman, mutilated in such a grotesque fashion, was a perfect storm for the tabloids. Within hours, the case was splashed across front pages. Soon, Elizabeth Short would be transformed from a struggling young dreamer into the infamous Black Dahlia. The name itself came from the press, not the police, inspired by the 1946 noir film The Blue Dahlia, and Elizabeth's rumored preference for stylish black clothing. Journalists coined the nickname the Black Dahlia. It was a title dripping with mystery, glamour, and darkness, one that cemented her place in crime lore. Overnight, Elizabeth Short became both victim and symbol, her identity consumed by a sensationalized image that would overshadow her real life. The investigation began immediately, but it was complicated by the swarm of reporters and the chaotic nature of the crime scene. In an era long before modern forensic techniques, detectives relied on fingerprints, witness statements, and leather police work. Elizabeth's fingerprints were eventually identified through FBI records, which had her arrest record from 1943 for underage drinking. By January 17, the victim had a name, and the media frenzy intensified. The details of Elizabeth's last days were pieced together by investigators, but the timeline was murky. She had been seen at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles on January 9, just days before her death. Witnesses reported that she was waiting in the lobby for someone, but who that person was remains a mystery. After leaving the Biltmore, Elizabeth vanished. For nearly a week, her whereabouts were unknown until her body appeared in Leimert Park. That gap in her timeline, those missing days, became one of the central puzzles of the case. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through Los Angeles. Newspapers printed graphic details of the mutilation, often exaggerating or inventing facts to sell copies. Headlines screamed about the ghoulish nature of the killing. Rumors circulated wildly that Elizabeth had been tortured for days, that she lived a double life, that she was tied to gangsters or Hollywood elites. Much of this was speculation, but it sold papers, and the public could not look away. The LAPD, meanwhile, was under immense pressure to solve the case. With national attention on Los Angeles, police were desperate for leads. Hundreds of tips poured in, but most led nowhere. Over the following weeks, dozens of men were questioned, from doctors to soldiers to petty criminals. The sheer savagery of the crime suggested a killer who was not only skilled, but also deeply disturbed. Yet despite exhaustive interviews, no clear suspect emerged. One of the most disturbing elements of the case came days after the murder. On January 23, 1947, the Los Angeles Examiner received a chilling package. Inside were Elizabeth's personal belongings, her birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book. The items had been carefully cleaned with gasoline to remove fingerprints. Accompanying the package was a taunting letter, pieced together from newspaper clippings, signed, "The Black Dahlia Avenger." The killer seemed to be mocking both police and press, feeding into the frenzy while demonstrating an eerie sense of control. This brazen communication only deepened the sense of fear gripping the city. Was the killer a medical professional, a deranged sadist, someone within Elizabeth's circle of acquaintances? Theories abounded, but none brought police closer to the truth. For every lead that seemed promising, another dead end appeared. The public's fascination with the case grew by the day. In cafes, workplaces, and homes across Los Angeles, people whispered about the Black Dahlia. Mothers warned their daughters about the dangers of walking alone at night. Men were scrutinized by neighbors, co-workers, and even their families, as suspicion fell on anyone with a hint of odd behavior. The case tapped into the darkest fears of the city, blending violence, sex, and mystery in a way that felt more like a film noir than reality. But this was no fiction. Elizabeth Short had been a real woman, and her family in Massachusetts was devastated by the media circus. Her mother, Phoebe, was reportedly told of her daughter's death by a journalist who pretended to be a police officer just to get an exclusive quote. The lack of sensitivity only added to the tragedy. For Elizabeth's loved ones, she was not the Black Dahlia. She was simply Beth, a daughter and sister whose life had been stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. The LAPD threw enormous resources into the investigation, interviewing more than 150 potential suspects in the weeks following the murder. Doctors, medical students, actors, and even transient drifters were questioned. At one point, more than 750 investigators, police officers, and sheriff's deputies were working the case. Yet, despite this massive effort, the identity of Elizabeth's killer remained elusive. By the end of January 1947, the Black Dahlia case had become the most infamous unsolved murder in Los Angeles history. The city was captivated, terrified, and hungry for answers, but none came. Instead, the murder of Elizabeth Short would grow into a legend, a dark tale of beauty, ambition, and horror set against the backdrop of a city chasing dreams. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, the Black Dahlia case would only become more tangled. Suspects emerged, confessions were made, and theories multiplied, but the truth remained hidden. The investigation had only just begun, but already it was shaping into a story of obsession, corruption, and unanswered questions. The murder of Elizabeth Short was not simply a crime. It was the beginning of a cultural phenomenon. And as the hunt for her killer dragged on, the line between fact and fiction blurred, turning tragedy into legend. The murder of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, quickly became one of the most challenging cases in Los Angeles Police Department history. While the brutality of the crime shocked the public, it also deeply frustrated investigators. The precision of the cuts suggested surgical skill. The body had been carefully cleaned, and the killer seemed to taunt authorities by sending personal belongings through the mail. For detectives, the question was no longer whether they could find suspects. It was how to sift through the overwhelming flood of them. From the very beginning, the LAPD was swamped with leads. Tips poured in by the hundreds from citizens, informants, and even attention seekers hoping to play a role in the spectacle. More than 150 men and women were interrogated, ranging from medical students and doctors to actors, servicemen, and known criminals. Detectives were under immense pressure to deliver answers to a terrified city. But as the weeks passed, the case became increasingly tangled. One of the earliest suspects was Robert "Red" Manley, a traveling salesman who had been the last confirmed person seen with Elizabeth before her disappearance. Manley admitted to dropping her off at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9, 1947, just days before her murder. He claimed she was waiting for someone and that he never saw her again. Manley voluntarily submitted to questioning and even agreed to a polygraph test, which he passed. While police initially considered him a strong suspect, he was eventually cleared. Attention then shifted to men with medical training, given the surgical precision of the body's dismemberment. Investigators interviewed several doctors and surgeons, hoping to connect their skills with the mutilation. At one point, suspicion fell on a local physician named Dr. Walter Bailey, whose daughter had been a friend of Elizabeth's. Bailey lived not far from where the body was found, and his medical expertise aligned with the crime's disturbing details. However, Bailey was never formally charged, and much of the evidence against him was circumstantial. Another doctor who emerged as a prime suspect years later was Dr. George Hodel, a wealthy Los Angeles physician with a dark reputation. Hodel was known for his flamboyant lifestyle, ties to Hollywood's elite, and a history of questionable behavior. Decades later, Hodel's own son, former LAPD detective Steve Hodel, would publicly accuse his father of being the Black Dahlia killer. Steve Hodel claimed that his father had both the surgical skill and the opportunity to commit the crime, and pointed to disturbing photographs and recorded conversations as evidence. While many consider George Hodel one of the most compelling suspects, the LAPD never formally charged him, and his guilt remains speculative. But doctors were far from the only suspects. The LAPD received over 60 confessions in the weeks following the murder, a number that would eventually climb to more than 500 over the decades. Some confessors were mentally ill individuals seeking attention, while others were criminals hoping to exploit the case for notoriety. Each confession required investigation, but nearly all were quickly dismissed as false. One particularly bizarre confession came from a man who walked into a police station and declared himself the killer, only to be ruled out after his story collapsed under basic questioning. In another case, a drifter was found carrying Elizabeth Short's belongings, but it turned out he had stolen them from the examiner's offices after they were returned by the police. The flood of false confessions not only wasted valuable time, but also reflected the sensational grip the Black Dahlia case had on the public imagination. As the investigation wore on, cracks began to show in the LAPD's handling of the case. The department faced criticism for allowing reporters too close to evidence, for failing to preserve the crime scene, and for leaking sensitive information to the press. Some accused the police of being more concerned with headlines than with justice. Others suspected that corruption within the LAPD, already notorious during the 1940s, may have hindered the case. The rumors only fueled conspiracy theories. Some believed Elizabeth Short had been connected to organized crime figures in Los Angeles, and that her murder was a mob warning or punishment. Others whispered about secret Hollywood parties, sexual exploitation, and cover-ups involving powerful men. The absence of concrete answers left space for speculation, and speculation grew into myth. One particularly persistent theory suggested that Elizabeth had been working as an escort or had ties to the seedy underworld of Los Angeles nightlife. The newspapers of the time often painted her as a party girl who courted danger. But many who knew her contradicted this narrative, describing her instead as polite, reserved, and even shy. The truth about her lifestyle remains contested, obscured by decades of rumor and sensationalism. As time passed, suspects continued to emerge. A Chicago police officer claimed his father had killed Elizabeth. A woman accused her own neighbor. Even distant relatives of Elizabeth herself came under suspicion. The case became a mirror onto which people projected their darkest fears and suspicions. Yet through it all, no definitive evidence tied any one person to the crime. Theories surrounding the case only deepened in the 1950s and beyond, when Los Angeles grew into a hub for noir culture and crime fiction. The Black Dahlia murder became a reference point for writers, filmmakers, and conspiracy theorists. Some claimed Elizabeth was killed by a secret sadist ring. Others believed she had been targeted because of knowledge she possessed about powerful figures. A few went so far as to suggest the murder was part of a larger pattern of ritualistic killings. None of these claims were ever proven, but their very existence showed how the case had moved beyond a crime into a cultural obsession. Even the FBI was involved in the investigation, though their files mostly reflected the same frustrations as the LAPD. Without witnesses, clear forensic evidence, or a reliable confession, the case stagnated. While many suspects were compelling on the surface, every path eventually led to a dead end. What made the Black Dahlia case so difficult was not just the brutality of the crime, but the deliberate way in which it seemed staged to confound investigators. The lack of blood at the dump site, the precision of the mutilation, the sending of taunting letters, it all suggested a killer who wanted to control the narrative. In many ways, the murderer succeeded. Police were left chasing shadows while the media devoured every rumor. By the end of 1947, the case had grown cold, though the public's fascination never waned. Detectives moved on to other crimes, but the Black Dahlia haunted Los Angeles. Each new tip, confession, or suspect would briefly reignite hope, only for disappointment to follow. The crime was unsolved, but it was never forgotten. The unsolved nature of the case made Elizabeth Short's murder more than just a tragedy. It made it an enduring mystery. And as the years turned to decades, her story would take on a life of its own, moving from newspaper headlines into books, films, and endless speculation. The line between fact and fiction blurred so much that even now, separating truth from myth is nearly impossible. The Black Dahlia was not just a victim of a horrific crime. She became a symbol of Hollywood's dark underbelly, of the dangers lurking beneath the glamour, and of the failures of justice in a city built on illusions. The suspects and confessions may have multiplied, but the one thing that remained constant was the silence of the killer. Whoever they were, they vanished into history, leaving only questions that remain unanswered to this day. The murder of Elizabeth Short was not simply a crime. It became a legend, one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. While the investigation into her death stagnated, the cultural afterlife of the Black Dahlia only grew stronger with each passing decade. What began as a front front-page story in the Los Angeles newspapers of 1947 evolved into a symbol of Hollywood's dark underbelly, a cautionary tale about ambition, beauty, and vulnerability in a city built on dreams and illusions. For decades, the case remained officially open, but in truth, it was cold. Detectives moved on, evidence was misplaced, and leads grew stale. Without modern forensic technology, investigators in the 1940s had limited tools at their disposal. DNA analysis, criminal profiling, and advanced forensics were still years away. The Black Dahlia killer left almost no traceable evidence, and the taunting letters only added to the confusion. By the 1950s, the case had become less about solving a crime and more about feeding public fascination. This fascination gave rise to countless books, films, and documentaries. In 1987, crime novelist James Ellroy, whose own mother had been murdered in Los Angeles when he was a child, published The Black Dahlia, a fictionalized retelling of the case. Ellroy's book, blending fact and fiction, became a bestseller and cemented the Dahlia's place in modern crime literature. The novel was later adapted into a 2006 film directed by Brian De Palma, further embedding the case into Hollywood mythology. But Ellroy was far from the only writer to tackle the story. Non-fiction works by journalists and investigators tried to parse the facts from the rumors. Some focused on potential suspects like Dr. George Hodel, building elaborate cases around circumstantial evidence. Others explored the LAPD's mishandling of the investigation, suggesting corruption or incompetence played a role in its failure. Still others leaned into conspiracy, claiming Elizabeth's death was tied to organized crime, secret government projects, or Hollywood scandals hidden from the public eye. What made the Black Dahlia case so enduring was not just its brutality, but its perfect fit within the noir atmosphere of mid-century Los Angeles. The city itself was in transition, an urban sprawl of glamorous movie stars, struggling dreamers, corrupt police, and shadowy figures operating in the margins. Elizabeth Short, with her striking looks, tragic life, and violent death, seemed almost like a character written for a noir script. Her murder blurred the line between reality and fiction, feeding a cultural appetite for mystery and darkness. As decades passed, the case continued to resurface in popular culture. Television shows from Unsolved Mysteries to American Horror Story have revisited the murder, dramatizing it for new audiences. Each new retelling added layers of myth, often distorting the truth further. Elizabeth herself was often portrayed less as a real woman and more as a symbol. The Black Dahlia, an icon of beauty and violence. This transformation into legend has kept her name alive, but at the cost of obscuring the person she truly was. Behind the myth, Elizabeth Short was not a femme fatale or a Hollywood starlet. She was a young woman in her early 20s, trying to survive in a difficult city. She had dreams of acting, desires for love and stability, and the vulnerabilities of someone navigating a world far larger than herself. Yet the brutality of her murder and the sensationalism of the press stripped away her humanity, turning her into a story rather than a person. This loss of identity is part of what makes her legacy so haunting. Despite the mountains of speculation one truth remains: the case is unsolved. The LAPD officially considers it open, though few believe it will ever be resolved. Over the decades, detectives, journalists, and amateur sleuths have proposed countless theories, but none have led to definitive proof. Many of the original suspects are long dead. Evidence has been lost or degraded. Time itself has become the greatest obstacle. Unless new forensic technology is able to uncover something from preserved evidence, the identity of Elizabeth Short's killer may never be known. One of the most persistent suspects, Dr. George Hodel, remains a focal point in discussions. His son Steve's investigation has convinced many that Hodel was the murderer, pointing to photographs resembling Elizabeth found among his belongings, as well as disturbing recordings in which Hodel seemed to allude to killing women. Yet critics argue that Steve's case is built on circumstantial evidence and hindsight, not hard proof. Others believe that while Hodel was a disturbing figure, he may not have been responsible for the Black Dahlia. The uncertainty fuels the story's power. In the absence of answers, the Black Dahlia case functions like a mirror, reflecting the anxieties, obsessions, and fantasies of each generation. For some, it is a tale of Hollywood corruption. For others, it is an example of systemic failure by police. For many, it is simply an unsolvable riddle that continues to haunt Los Angeles. Even today, nearly 8 decades later, people visit the site in Leimert Park where Elizabeth's body was found. Writers, filmmakers, and podcasters revisit the case, trying to piece together what really happened in those final days of January 1947. Each new retelling introduces Elizabeth Short to a new audience, ensuring that her story is never forgotten. But beyond the sensationalism, beyond the noir imagery and the lurid headlines, lies a simple truth. A young woman's life was brutally taken, and justice was never served. Elizabeth Short was more than the Black Dahlia. She was a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Her memory deserves more than the myth it became. The tragedy of the Black Dahlia lingers not only because of its mystery, but because of what it represents. It reminds us of the dangers faced by the vulnerable, of the dark currents beneath the surface of glamour, and of the ease with which real lives can be transformed into stories for public consumption. It also highlights the limits of justice, the failures of institutions, and the enduring power of unanswered questions. In the end, perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Black Dahlia case is not the brutality of the crime itself, but the silence that followed. Silence from the killer who vanished into history. Silence from the justice system, unable to provide closure, and silence from Elizabeth herself, whose voice was drowned out by the myth created around her. The Black Dahlia remains one of the great American mysteries, a story that has outlived its era and continues to fascinate. But if we look past the sensationalism, we see not just a mystery, but a reminder that behind every crime, behind every headline, is a human being who once had dreams, fears, and a life worth remembering. Elizabeth Short's story will forever remain unsolved, but her memory endures, not as a Hollywood character, not as a myth, but as a woman whose life, though tragically cut short, continues to echo through history. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Black Dahlia. Not the horror of her death, but the enduring call to remember her humanity.